The Charles Stanley Institute for Christian Living presents the C.S. Lewis Lecture Series, Part 3, The Loves of C.S. Lewis.
The first impression of speaking about C.S. Lewis and the idea of love would certainly be incongruous and might almost be comic. To view this heavy-set, pipe-smoking, rumpled, loud, and bellowing Don as a lover strikes against all popular notions of romantic literature. It's like imagining your grandparents or a bachelor uncle as a lover. There's no Casanova here, no Lord Byron, no Don Juan, no Brad Pitt. Just a dumpy, middle-aged professor who thought about and then practiced many different varieties of love. Lewis's view of love is simply grounded in his beliefs on the nature of reality and our relationship to God. Human existence is not lived in isolation. We are made for community. We are made for love. The fundamental ethic of the Christian life in this community is love. But alas, we neglect to practice it as we should. Now, in the late 1950s, after Lewis had become somewhat of a celebrity with his image on the cover of Time magazine, he was approached by the Episcopal Radio TV Foundation in Atlanta, Georgia, to record a series of lectures on love. The talks, which will later serve as a basis for his book, The Four Loves, were finished by the summer of 1958. Lewis met the coordinator of the series, a Mrs. Rakestraw, in London, where they recorded on 19th to 20th of August, and he was paid a grand total of $300 for the lectures. While it did not affect one word of the talks, Lewis did not get along too well with Mrs. Rakestraw. To begin with, he kept imagining that her name was Cartwheel. It was, however, her desire to change his scripts which annoyed him greatly. His wife Joy had written to a mutual friend, Chad Walsh, and asked, "Why did you get my poor Jack mixed up with this insufferable Rakestraw, or whatever her name is?" She began by criticizing his opening words. "Today I want to discuss." "Oh, Professor Lewis, couldn't you say instead, 'Let us think together, you and I, about—'" No, he couldn't. "But we want you to give the feeling of embracing the audience." Jack said if they wanted an embracer, they had the wrong man. "Well, perhaps I mean a feeling of involvement." "Ugh," said Lewis. "At the end, she made me sit absolutely silent before the microphone for a minute and a half so they could feel my living presence." But there was worse to come. After Mrs. Rakestraw returned to Atlanta with the recordings, the foundation began a huge advertising campaign which made it sound as if Lewis were coming to America to give the talks. There was an article announcing Dr. Lewis for the Episcopal Church magazine, The Living Church. C.S. Lewis, churchman, author, lecturer, philosopher, and professor of English at Cambridge University, will speak to American radio audiences in 1959 on the weekly Episcopal Hour program. The coming program, produced by the Episcopal Radio TV Foundation, will be broadcast over 325 stations as part of the year-round Protestant Hour program. But this was before the bishops on the board of the foundation knew what Lewis said about Eros. After hearing the tapes, they decided they were too frank for the American people. The whole series was then canceled, and a second article, Love Talks, appeared in the Living Church magazine, saying, "The 10 talks by C.S. Lewis, originally announced as the spring offering by the Episcopal Radio Hour, led to some lively discussion among those responsible for the program. The noted English author has pulled no punches in discussing sex and explaining its place in the Christian view of love. So we have decided to just postpone or cancel the recordings." On being told about this, Joy wrote her friend again and said, "Now we learn, not from the organization, but from a friend, that they decided to suppress the whole series because of Jack's startling frankness in sexual matters." But one must remember, this is the era in 1958, early 60s, in which American women sought to persuade President Kennedy to have animals clothed in the interest of decency. When Lewis heard this, he found the idea ludicrous. What fun, he wrote. The elephant looks as if he wore trousers already, but terribly baggy ones. The rhino seems to wear a suit much too big for him. Can it be taken in? What sort of collars will giraffes wear? Will seals and others have ordinary clothes or bathing suits? The hedgehog will wear out his shirts terribly quickly, I suppose. It fell to Mrs. Rakestraw to explain to Lewis that his startling frankness was occasioned by his talks on Eros. Professor Lewis, she said to him, I'm afraid you brought sex into your talks on Eros. My dear Mrs. Cartwheel, he replied, how can you talk about Eros and leave it out? In the end, Mrs. Rakestraw was not able to broadcast the talks over the Foundation's radios, but they were offered to individual radio stations across the country and to college campuses. Now, before dealing with the 4 kinds of laughter that Lewis is talking about here, I want to distinguish 3 characteristics that Lewis said characterize all of these. He calls them gift love, need love, and appreciative love. The first is gift love. That is a love that one gives out of strength, mostly in God giving to us. The typical example would be that love which moves us to work and to plan and to save for the future well-being of our family, which we may die without seeing grown up. The second kind of love is need love. It is a love out of poverty. The example here is that which sends a lonely child or a frightened child to its mother's arms. We were born helpless, and we should recognize that we live throughout our lives as helpless people. As soon as we are conscious, we discover loneliness. We discover that we need others physically, emotionally, intellectually. We need them if we are to know anything, even ourselves. Now, Lewis emphasized that need love is not selfishness, but is built into our very nature of human beings. It is not good, he said, for man to be alone. In fact, Lewis argued that need love is a sign of spiritual help for our love for God and others. The more we need others shows that we have a humility and a recognition for what we were made for. God calls us in our need and our strength. The third way we taste love is what Lewis called the loves of pleasure or appreciation. Neither a giving love or a needy love. It is rather a recognition of things that are good, that are beautiful, that are right. Whenever we catch an unexpected smell of roses, or a row of sweet peas, or honeysuckle, or the pleasure of a good steaming cup of French roast coffee early in the morning, we have a pleasure, a love of something that we appreciate. However, the repeated enjoyment of this kind of pleasure can turn this delight into an addiction and into a type of need. And we all need our French roast coffee every morning. Now, appreciative pleasures and loves make us feel that something has not merely gratified our senses, but claimed our appreciation by right. To see the garden patch of bright yellow daffodils grinning from the roadside reminds us that we are called to enjoy them. They are there for us to recognize that they have been planted by God. We are able, almost like God, to pronounce things good. This attention is offered to such delights and wonders as a kind of debt. It is a right and proper response to good things. So, need love cries to God from our poverty. Gift love tries to serve or even to suffer for God. Appreciative love says to God, we give you thanks for your great glory. We recognize how wonderful you are to us. Need love says of a woman, I cannot live without her. Gift love longs to give her happiness, comfort, protection, maybe even wealth. Appreciative love gazes and holds its breath and is silent, rejoices that such a wonderful creature could exist, even if not for him, but the fact that she exists and we can appreciate the beauty that is there. In actual life, thank God, observed Lewis, these 3 elements of love mix, and succeed one another moment by moment. Now, these three characteristics are never existing alone, but they're always in some kind of chemical mix and blend. In his Four Loves, Lewis lists 4 kinds of love plus a category for the subhuman, like loving lawyers. In his likings and long lovings for the subhuman, Lewis identifies 2 special kinds of love: the love of nature and the love of country. In the love of nature, Lewis points out how Englishmen and Russians enjoy the moods of the seasons and the spirit of places, from the Lake District to the frozen tundra. A person is called to receive and enjoy the obvious richness, the grace, and the harmony of nature, as well as its grimness, its bleakness, its terror, its monotony. Lewis recommended laying oneself bare and open to the glory of nature's moments. Look, listen, attend. Nature does not teach that God exists. What it does is help provide for us the meanings of words like glory or terror. There are, Lewis points out with too much relish, not only primroses in the woods, but worms in the belly that are part of nature. And we are to look at that and marvel. Like Annie Dillard in her Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, one sees both the horror of nature as well as its beauty. So one should neither romanticize it nor exploit it. As the psalmist wrote, "The heavens declare the glory of God." So we can see an image of glory. But Lewis warns we must not try to find a path, a direct path to it, for an increasing knowledge of God. That path will peter out almost at once. Terrors and mystery, the whole depth of God's counsels, and the whole tangle of history of the universe choke it. We can't get through to God simply through nature. We must make a detour. There are times we must leave the woods and the hills and go back to our studies, to our church, to our Bibles, and to our knees. Otherwise, the love of nature begins to turn into a nature religion. And then, even if it does not lead one to the dark gods, the dogs of violence, of sex, of hunger, and sheer power, it will lead to a great deal of nonsense. One key element or line that Lewis repeats throughout this book is that any natural love, which is a gift, that tries to become a god will soon become a demon. Anything that we lift up, no matter how noble or good it is, the love of parents, the love of a spouse, the love of children, if it becomes the all-consuming love, it will become a horror. In the love of country, or of any group, we recognize how the love of one's country can become a demon, particularly if we looked at Nazi Germany, when it becomes the primary god of our lives. It can even be seen in a love for a home, for a church, for a school, for a football team like the USC Trojans, my team. This earthly society can never be fully the kingdom of God. No man, said one of the Greeks, loves his city because it is great. We love our cities, our teams, our churches because it is ours. We must be aware of the false transcendence that is given to things which are very much of this world. And the love of country and the love of nature are good things, subhuman things, and we're called to love them, but not too much. Now, of the 4 loves, affection, friendship, eros, and agape, the first is affection, or storge, S-T-O-R-G-E, storge. This is the love especially of parents to offspring, and it's responsible for probably 9/10 of whatever is solid and durable happiness in our own lives. Even among coworkers, this is a love that can grow over time. It is the humblest and most widely diffused. There's a warm comfortableness to storge, to affection. It is the least discriminating of all the loves. You don't have to put on airs. Almost anyone can become an object of affection. The ugly, the stupid, even the exasperating. These people are there for us, or not really for us, but for us to learn to love. 3 criteria of affection. First is familiarity. It is the old, the endearing old that we take for granted. It's domestic affection, sitting around the home. Now, we can sometimes point to the very day and hour when we fell in love. We remember our first kiss, or when we began a new friendship with someone. But I doubt if we ever catch affection beginning. You become aware of it as you become aware that it has already been going on for quite a while. It also has breadth. It leads to a wide taste in humanity. It teaches us with people who would never be our friends, first to notice how weird and odd they are, then to endure them, then to smile at them, and then to enjoy them, and finally to appreciate the people who happen to be there in the next cubicle. Made for us? Thank God, no. They are themselves odder than you could ever have believed and worth far more than you could have guessed. Once Lewis remarked on the affection quite often found between a cat and a dog. A friend replied, "Yes, but I bet no dog would ever confess it to the other dogs." Then there is humility. Affection almost slinks or seeps into our lives. It lives with a humble, undress, private things. Soft slippers, old clothes, old jokes, the thump of a sleepy dog's tail on the floor. It gives a homespun affection to all of our other loves. There is no need to talk with this kind of friend. There is no need to stay awake. There are no needs at all except perhaps to stoke the fire. But there are dangers associated with affection. First, people often crave and demand a right to have this love of affection from you. After all, we've been together so long. You have to love me. There are no recipes for the bliss. It is not given because of its merits. We have no right to expect it from others, but there is a reasonable expectation of being loved by our intimates if we and they are ordinary people. Affection can aggravate the demands one person puts on another. One such person who entered Lewis's life was, quite serendipitously, was the attractive Mrs. Moore. She was the mother of Patty Moore, his friend who was killed during the war. Janie Moore, whom he called Minto, was the mother of this friend. And whatever the relationship was at first, and some believed that it was sexual, there was some kind of sexual attraction when Lewis came back from the war, it became a sort of self-imposed slavery of Lewis, as he would serve the older, domineering woman faithfully. She disapproved vehemently of his Christian faith, denouncing his participation in communion as his going to a blood feast. His brother Warnie remembered that in the last 15 years of her reign, "I don't think I ever saw Jack work more than half an hour without the cry of, 'Ball boys,' her nickname for Jack, and his response, 'Coming.' Down would go his pen, and he would be away for perhaps 5 minutes or perhaps half an hour, possibly to do nothing more than to stand by the kitchen range as a scullery maid or to put the dog or cat out. Then he would go back up to another spell of work, then the same thing all over again. These nagging interruptions were the conditions under which all of his books were published, with continual interruptions. Affection becomes kind of a perversion, and it was found on this one epitaph of a grave. Erected by her sorrowing brothers in memory of Martha Clay. Here's one who lived for others. Now she has peace, and so have they. There are those who try to live so much for us and get into our lives and control our lives that we do not have the peace of them. Second, Lewis points out that the term old has also its weary and loathing side. Old habits, old tricks, the same old things. We've been married a long time and you're still the same old person. Such demands as an old maternal vampire, exacting care of a child. Herein is the danger of losing the courtesy of home affection. He may be the life of the party outside the home, an impressive gentleman at church, but you should see how rude and uncivil he is at home. You should see how lazy he is on the sofa. Affection is an affair of old clothes, of sweet, unguarded moments, but old clothes are one thing. To wear the same shirt till it stank would be another. Come live with me and you'll know how I live. Whether it should obey the rules that guide courtesy, affection too frequently takes liberties. Now, a third and last danger is jealousy. A jealousy of affection is closely connected with its reliance on what is old and familiar. We do not want familiar and comfortable things to change. We do not want familiar faces to become brighter and more beautiful or more popular. We want the old ways to stay the way they are. Change is a threat to affection. There's an old kind of practice up in Virginia Beach called catching your crabs, crabology. Crabology is the study of catching crabs. And if you know, there is never a lid on your pail when you're collecting crabs, because you can put them all in there. And when one crab starts to kind of get out of the pail, what happens? The others pull the crab back in. There is no room for change. So we are all crabs. If someone starts to change for the better, we want to pull them back down to our level so we can keep them the way we are comfortable with. When a member of the family begins to like poetry, or when someone that you know becomes a Christian and your family is not a Christian, the reaction is one like desertion or robbery. Children growing up and away from their parents break their mother's hearts. But the proper aim of giving this love is to put the recipient into a state where he or she no longer needs our gift. We feed children, we teach them, we preach, that others may do the same to other people. In fact, the task of teachers and preachers should aim at making ourselves superfluous. We should become unnecessary. If we are any good at what we do, we should always be working towards that goal in which our students and our pupils are fit to become our critics and our rivals. Affection, when healthy and respected, when simply arising and being enjoyed, gives us the most wonderful daily gladness. The second love is philia. Philia is friendship. It's a discovery of mutual interest among people. In fact, when Lewis once was forced to go and visit an invalid neighbor whose name was Arthur Greaves, he went over there to see the boy in the bed, and he looked at his nightstand, and there was a copy of Norse myths. And Lewis looked at it and he exclaimed, "What? You too? I thought nobody else enjoyed Norse myths like I did." And the two began a friendship that would last for their lifetimes and wrote numerous letters back and forth. But it was finding that one common element that you were both interested in. The modern world ignores this kind of friendship that you see between Jonathan and David, or they pervert it to something else. But Lewis points out that friendship and eros are radically different. Friendship talks side by side, absorbed in something else out there, a common interest, while eros talks about love face to face, only between two. Friendship looks out at something else, eros looks at each other. Now, companionship is not real friendship, but it can turn into friendship, finding some common taste or interest or insight. The paradox is that friendship is impossible to anyone who just wants a friend. It has to be something else that you want that brings you together. Lewis talks about three characters: Ronald, who could have been J.A.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and Caroline. He said when these three are together, they bring out of each other, in jokes and arguments and ordinary experiences, something that is so special. Every soul communicates something more of the divine. But author Charles Lamb, the great British poet, said that if one of the three friends should die, then the others lose not only the friend who died, but what that friend brought out in the others. In each of our friends, there is something that only one other friend can fully bring out of us. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole personality of another friend into action. I need other lights than my own to show all of his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to one of his jokes. Far from having more of Ronald now, having him to myself now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. Hence, true friendship is the least jealous of all the loves. Two friends delight to be joined by a third, and three by a fourth. Nothing so enriches, Lewis thought, an erotic love as the discovery that the beloved can truly, deeply, and spontaneously enter into friendship with the friends you already have. And we know the problems of having friends that our spouses do not like. But if we were made to choose, which should we choose? Which choice should we not regret after we had made it? Now, women and men being friends is another issue, and it was seen in the movie When Harry Met Sally. The middle-aged male has great powers of passive resistance and indulgence, so much that a woman friend can drag him to concerts, dances, and even to lectures on British authors, and he will obediently, quietly tag along. Now, Lewis had developed a friendship with a poet and a painter named Ruth Pitter, who playfully engaged him by challenging anachronistic aspects of Narnia. If, she posed, if it's always winter in Narnia, where did the beavers get such a splendid lunch of potatoes, oranges, milk, malt, and hops for beavers' beer? Aha! Even as he replied in bluffing, she had stumped him as a friend. But this is what friends do. He was to be stumped even more deeply by another pen friend, Helen Joy Davidman Gresham, a loud, brash New Yorker who had been a screenplay writer in Hollywood and written the book Letters to a Comrade, all communistic. She was no shrinking violet. When he entertained her on a tour of Magdalen College, her enthusiasm, her interest, and her impudent questions made us roar with laughter. I suppose the quantity of good wine that we had drunk contributed to our laughter. Nevertheless, she was funny and engaged, and they had common interest in literature, in ideas, and in debate. Lewis found that in a perfect friendship, appreciative love is, I think, often so great and so firmly based that each member of the friendship feels in his own secret heart humbled before all of the rest of his friends. Sometimes he wonders, what is he doing there among all of these wonderful people who are so much more fun than he or she is? He is lucky to be in such company, especially when the whole group is together, each bringing out that which is best and wisest and funniest in everyone else. Those were the golden seasons, wrote Lewis, when 4 or 5 of us, after a hard day's walking, have come to our inn. When our slippers are on, our feet spread out toward the blazing fire, and our drinks at our elbows. When the whole world and something beyond the world opens itself up to our minds as we talk. And no one has any claim on any responsibility for one another, but we're all free men and equals as if we had just met an hour ago. While at the same time, an affection mellowed by the years enfolds us all into a loving community. Life, natural life, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it? Now, several facts of friendship, 3 facts. 1, authorities tend to distrust friendships for good reason. Little rebellions occur in pockets of early Christians who survived because they cared exclusively for the love of the brothers and sisters, and they stopped their ears to the opinions of the pagan society outside of them. If you want to protect children from society and culture, you find those friends, you pray for those friends, that together they can become little radicals of friends. Men who have had real friends are less easy to manage or get at. It's harder for authorities to correct. And it's also harder for authorities to corrupt. Herein, friendships can be both a school for virtue or a school for vice. Secondly, a group of friends may give off an appearance of exclusiveness, of being stuck-up prigs. The danger for Christians is that they can become us versus them, a group of snobs, an inner ring. Third, Lewis believed that friendship rarely fits the image under which Scripture represents the love between God and man. And here's where I disagree with Lewis, because we find in affection that God is presented as a father. In Eros, God is presented as a bridegroom for his bride, the church. But he is also, I believe, presented as a friend when he tells his disciples, "No longer do I call you servants, but I call you friends." Now, if friendship is, what? You too, Eros is, you. You. Eros is being in love versus Venus. Venus is the sexual act. It's sexuality. It's the carnal act distinguished from being in love. Lewis confessed that his own views on this topic of Eros were humbly submitted and open to correction to people that were better lovers, and better Christians. But he still set forth what he thought about Eros. In his views on women, he may have been insightful, but he confessed to being very fallible. As we remember, his mother died early. In addition to his brother, his friends were all boys and men. He attended all boys' schools, and he had a rationalistic, empirical male tutor. Mrs. Moore was an unusual, shrewish housemate, and Ruth Pitter and Joy Davidman came into the scene quite late. Lewis, in fact, learned of love as he learned to love. He knew all too much of affection run riot with his years of Mrs. Moore. He knew and he valued friendship with his hearty male friends. But Eros, Eros, in its wilder, saltier forms, he had maybe tasted in his youth. He had fought against with quiet acceptance since his conversion, even to the point of abstaining from certain foods because he saw them as aphrodisiacs. They would excite him a little too much if he ate them. The curious progress of relationship and romance between Lewis and Joy began in friendship. To be sure, he wrote, what is offered as friendship by one side may be mistaken by Eros on the other, with painful and embarrassing results. Or what begins as friendship in both may also become Eros. He said when he married Joy, I never expected to have in my 60s the happiness that passed me by in my 20s. And when I go to a hotel with Joy, I feel like such a naughty boy. And then see how I have dwindled into becoming a husband. Eros is mostly enamored of the woman as she is. Eros starts simply with the delightful preoccupation of the beloved. A man in this state really hasn't the leisure to think of sex. He is not thinking of Venus, he is thinking of the beloved. He is too busy thinking of one person. Sexual desire without Eros wants it, the thing in itself, the sensory pleasure, an event that occurs in one's own body. A lustful man prowling the streets doesn't want a woman. He wants, strictly speaking, a pleasure for which a woman happens to be the necessary piece of apparatus. She is an instrument to his pleasure. It is not she that is important. Now, Lewis's discussion of sex is laced with satire. In fact, he talked about our culture's, his culture's dominant obsession with sex. That was one, and he compared it to kind of a hunger for food. And so what he created was what he called a mutton chop striptease. Imagine a country, he proposed, where you could fill a theater for hungry men. And you bring a covered dish on stage, and you slowly lift the cover so that all can see a glimpse of mutton chop or a slice of bacon, and then you close it. He says, are we starved or gluttonous people? What has so perverted this natural good desire of men for women and women for men that we begin to engage in this? Eros wants the beloved. Eros makes a man really want not a woman, but one particular woman. It is fully appreciative pleasure. And Lewis believed, too, that we take Venus, the sexual act, far too seriously, at any rate with the wrong kind of seriousness. Is the joy of sex, the joy of math, the joy of Christian sex, all of these things that are out there, they're so clinical and intense. And he says your basis for self-esteem sometimes and mental health get into these kind of serious things. He says what is needed is an old-fashioned roar of laughter when it comes to sex. Sex as well as eating are serious, he says. Both have sacramental and moral aspects, but both of them are for our enjoyment and our laughter. We must not be totally serious about Venus, he wrote. Indeed, we can't be totally serious without doing violence to our own humanity. It is not of nothing that every language and literature in the world is full of jokes about sex. In fact, in my book for Broadman Press, The Mother of All Laughter, there was one joke that the press censored. And it was an old kind of Yiddish joke that I picked up. And it was Abraham and Sarah and how they get together. And I took the 5 verses out of Genesis and did a midrash on all of them. It was kind of like Seinfeld meets the Prayer of Jabez coming together and looking at these 5 verses. And the 5 verses were, and Sarah laughed to herself. I thought, what do 90-year-old pregnant women in the desert laugh at? And second, and God says, and why did Sarah laugh? Here's God who can't understand women. And third, Sarah said, I did not laugh. And the Lord said, yes, you did. And so we deny the laughter that is there. And fourth, the Lord says, we'll call the child Isaac, Yishak. Yishak in Hebrew means laughter. So God participates in the joke and says, call the child laughter. This is fun. And then finally Sarah says, and everyone who hears of this will laugh with me. And so you have these 5, and I began to kind of explore them. And then I put this one joke in where Abraham comes home to Sarah and he says, Sarah, God says we've been so patient, we've waited so long that tonight we're going to have super sex. And Sarah says, at your age, take the soup. I don't know. Many of the jokes in literature may be dull or disgusting and nearly all of them old. But we must insist that they embody an attitude towards sex and Venus which in the long run endangers the Christian life far less than taking it too seriously. We must not attempt to find an absolute in the flesh. Banish play and laughter from the marriage bed of love, and you will let in a false goddess. The mass of people are perfectly right in their conviction that Venus is a partly comic spirit. She is mocking and mischievous, far more an elf than a deity, and she makes fun of us. When all the external circumstances are fittest for her service, when a husband and a wife are ready with desire, she will leave one or both lovers totally indisposed for it. When every overt act is impossible and even glances cannot be exchanged in trains, in shops, or at interminable parties, Venus will assail both people with all her force. An hour later, when the time and the place agree, she will have mysteriously withdrawn, perhaps from only one of them. What a bother this is. What resentments, self-pity, suspicions, wounded vanities, and all the current chatter about frustration in those who have deified her. But sensible lovers laugh. It is all part of the game. A catch as catch can, and the escapes and tumbles and the head-on collisions are treated as a romp. For Lewis said, I can hardly help regarding it as one of God's jokes that a passion so soaring, so apparently transcendent as Eros, should thus be linked to our bodily appetites, like any other appetite, which tactlessly reveals its connections to such mundane factors as weather, health, diet, circulation, and digestion. In Eros, at times we seem to be flying, but Venus gives us that sudden twitch that reminds us we are simply captive balloons. It is a continual demonstration of the truth that we are composite creatures. We are connected. We are rational or spiritual animals. On one side, connected to the angels, on the other side, to tomcats. It is a bad thing, wrote Lewis, not to be able to take a joke. Worse, not to be able to take a divine joke. Made, I grant you, at our expense, but also for our endless benefit. So levity is given to keep us from keeping Eros becoming too divine and subsequently too demonic. But Eros also requires marriage promises of fidelity to protect what Eros itself cannot perform. Like a religious conversion, old moods and whims return. Strength, sweetness, terror, passion needs to be ruled. Eros needs help. The natural loves are not self-sufficient. The excitement of Eros never lasts. It is the push to start you towards marriage. And you need to feel not depressed when it goes away. It will be good for your spiritual life, but you enjoy the beginning and then you discipline it. Now, being in love is a good thing, but not the best thing. There are many things below it, but there are also many things above it. You cannot make it the basis of your whole life. It is a noble feeling to be in love, but it is still a feeling. Now, no feeling can be relied on to last in its full intensity, or even to last at all. Knowledge can last, principles can last, habits can last, but feelings come and go. In fact, whatever people say, the state of being in love doesn't usually last. If the old fairy tale ending, they lived happily ever after, is taken to mean they felt for the next 50 years exactly as they felt the day before they were married, then it says what probably never was nor ever could be true, and would be highly undesirable if it were true. Who could bear to live in such excitement for even 5 years, for 5 months? What will become of your work, your appetite, your sleep, your friendships? But of course, ceasing to be in love does not mean ceasing to love. Love in this second sense, as distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling. It is a deep unity, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced in Christian marriages by the grace which both parents ask and receive from God. They can have this love for each other even at those moments when they do not like each other, as you love yourself even when you do not like yourself. They can retain this love even when it would be easier if they allow themselves to be in love with someone else. Being in love first moved them to promise fidelity, This quieter love enables them to keep the promise. It is on this love that the engine of marriage is run. Being in love is the explosion that starts it. In 1953, Lewis met the woman whom he would marry, an American named Joy Davidman, who had corresponded with him and became a Christian through his letters. Warren Lewis, his brother, describes the relationship as, at first, undoubtedly intellectual. Joy was the only person whom he had met who had a brain which matched his own in suppleness, in width of interest, in analytical grasp, and above all, in humor and sense of fun. Further, she shared his delight in argument for argument's sake, whether frivolous or serious, always good-humored, yet always meeting an unbound contempt for the sentimental. Setting herself high standards, she could laugh at the seeming absurdities to which they sometimes carried her. There was one element the relationship developed, however, that Lewis alluded to very openly as he wrote in an acquaintance in 1956. "I am very likely," he wrote, "to be both a bridegroom and a widower, for Joy has cancer. You need not mention this till the marriage is announced." Suffering for Lewis was an inescapable part of loving. There was, however, side by side with the poignancy of this time, an ongoing playfulness. Lewis's perspective on Eros was that it was the subject of countless jokes, and when the circumstances of the lovers are so tragic that no bystander could keep back his tears, they themselves, in desperate ways in a hospital ward, will sometimes be surprised by a merriment which strikes the onlooker, but not them, as unbearably pathetic. Nothing is falser than the idea that mockery is necessarily hostile. Until couples have a baby to laugh at, lovers are always laughing at each other. In A Grief Observed, Lewis shook his puny fist at what seemed to him a cosmic sadist behind the brass heavens. Yet he realized that a perfectly good God in this manner hardly seems less formidable than a cosmic sadist. The more we believe that God hurts to heal, the less we can believe that there is any use in begging for tenderness. A cruel man might be bribed, might grow tired of his vile sport, might have a temporary fit of mercy, as alcoholics have a fit of sobriety. But suppose that what you are up against is a surgeon whose intentions are wholly good. The kinder and more conscientious the surgeon is, the more inexorably he will go on cutting you. If he yielded to your entreaties, if he stopped before the operation was complete, all the pain up to that point would have been useless. If there is a good God, then these tortures are necessary. What do people mean to say, "I'm not afraid of God because I know He is good"? Have they never been to the dentist? The final type of love Lewis called agape, or true charity. It is divine love. It is God's gift of love to us, fully undeserved and liberating. It is this love that the Apostle Paul writes about in his famous passage in 1 Corinthians 13. Religious faith, Lewis frequently pointed out, simply meant putting first things first. When I have learned to love God better than my earthly dearest, I shall love my earthly dearest better than I do now. Some writers use the word charity to describe not only Christian love between human beings, but also God's love for man and man's love for God. About the second of these two, people are often worried. They are told that they ought to love God. They cannot find any such feelings in themselves. What are they to do? The answer is the same as before. Act as if you loved God. Do not sit trying to manufacture feelings. Ask yourself, if I were sure that I loved God, what would I do? And when you have found the answer, go and do it. If we do not love our neighbors who we have seen, how can we love God whom we have not seen? The rule for all of us is perfectly simple. Do not waste your time about whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did it. As soon as we do this, we will find one of the great secrets of love. When you are behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love them. If you injure someone you dislike, you will find yourself disliking that person more. If you do her a good turn, you will find yourself disliking her less. There is indeed one exception. If you do her a good turn, not to please God and obey the law of charity, but to show her what a fine, forgiving chap you are, and to put her in your debt and sit down and wait for the gratitude, you will probably be disappointed. People are not fools. They have a very quick eye for showing off or patronage. But whenever we do good to another self, just because it is a self made like us in God's image and desiring its own happiness as we desire ours, we shall have learned to love a little more, or at least to dislike less. Consequently, though Christian charity sounds a very cool thing to people whose heads are full of sentimentality, and though it is quite distinct from affection, yet it leads to affection. The difference between a Christian and a worldly man is not that the worldly man has only affections or liking, and the Christian has only charity. The worldly man treats people kindly because he likes them. The Christian, trying to treat everyone kindly, finds himself liking more and more people as he goes on, including people he could never have imagined liking. The same spiritual law works in reverse. The Germans at first ill-treated the Jews because they hated them. Afterwards, they hated them much more because they ill-treated them. The more cruel you are, the more you will hate. And the more you hate, the more cruel you will become. And so on in a vicious cycle forever. Good and evil both increase at compound interest. That is why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. In dealing with agape, Lewis thought there is no safe investment in loving. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will certainly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping your heart intact, you must give it to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it up carefully with hobbies and other little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, your heart will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers of love is hell. In heaven there will be no anguish and no turning away from our earthly beloveds. First, because we shall have already turned towards God. We have turned from the portraits to the original, from the rivulets to the fountain, from the creatures he made lovable to love himself. But secondly, we shall find that all of our forms of love, all the natural forms of love, are in Christ. By loving him more than them, we shall love them more than we ever could have. If we cannot practice the presence of God, Lewis says, it is something to practice the absence of God. We become increasingly aware of our unawareness until we feel like men who should stand beside a great cataract and hear no noise, or like a man in the story who looks in the mirror and finds no face there, or a man in a dream who stretches out his hand to visible objects and gets no sensation. To know that one is dreaming is to be no longer perfectly asleep. But for news of the fully waking world, you must go to my betters, he says. Now, Lewis recounted a story about his wife, Joy, who had been haunted all morning by the Holy Spirit as she went about her work with the obscure sense that God was at her elbow, demanding her attention. And of course, not being a perfected saint, she had the feeling that God had a question for her, as it usually was, of some unrepented sin or some tedious duty he wanted her to do. At last, she gave in. I know how one puts it off. And she faced him. But the message of God to her was, I want to give you something you can enjoy. And she instantly entered into his love and joy. The translator of the Bible, the Phillips Bible, J.B. Phillips, was sitting in his room late one night. And as he was there, he had a vision of C.S. Lewis coming to him that he said was almost palpable. And not being a mystical man, he was there. And Lewis came and said, it is easier than we thought. It is easier than we thought. The grace and love of God is poured upon us more than we can ever realize. He comes to interrupt our days and to surprise us. When I was in seminary, there was a professor, Mel, who was a workaholic. And he would sit in his office, and one Monday morning, he was sitting there, and about 10 o'clock, there was a knock on his door. I said, Mel, it's Jack. It's time for coffee, my friend. Oh, hi, Jack. How you doing? I've got to grade some papers today, so how about we do it a little later? Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Jack, I want to get these papers done, and I'll give you an hour later on. Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Well, Mel knew he wouldn't get rid of Jack unless he gave him 5-10 minutes. So he went and had coffee, and that was great. He came back and finished his papers. The next day, 10 o'clock. Hey, Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Mel said, Jack, that was funny yesterday. I've got a speech. I've got to get ready for the president. Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. Jack, please, just let me get this done. Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. And so Mel went with Jack and had coffee and came back and was refreshed. Next morning, 10 o'clock, Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. For the next 3 weeks, every morning at 10 o'clock, Mel, it's 10 o'clock. It's coffee time, my friend. On Friday of the 4th week, there was no knock. At 10:01, Mel checked his watch, went into the hall, ran down the hall to Jack's office, threw the door open, and there was Jack with his arms spread out and said, I knew you'd come. Every morning, God tries to wake us up and say, it's 10 o'clock. It's time to spend some time with me. It's time for you to know the love I have for you and all the varieties of love. And we have been given Lewis, and Lewis has shown us these kinds of love, the storge, the philia, the eros, and the agape, that are ours in abundance. And if only we wake up, we will enjoy his love. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Part 3, The Loves of C.S. Lewis, brought to you by the Charles Stanley Institute for Christian Living.